In an ever-globalizing world, in order to understand current circumstances and future possibilities, we must seek to understand the influential parties involved. The United States and China are two of the largest economies, and their influences can be seen and felt across the world. With one of the world's fastest-growing economies, China will play an ever more critical role in the future. American audiences may have a large amount of exposure through the news to relations between China and the United States. However, there seems to be less dialogue about Taiwan and the strained cross-strait relations that it experiences with China. Understanding Taiwan can lead to better understanding of the region and can perhaps shed light on the direction that China will take in the future. In order to understand Taiwan today, it is necessary to consider its past. Taiwan has undergone many changes in power. In the 1680s, Taiwan was under control of China and remained that way for a significant period of time. In 1895, following the end of the First Sino-Japanese War, China seized control of Taiwan to Japan. In 1945, Japan is defeated in World War II and China regains control of Taiwan. 1947 is remembered in Taiwan for the infamous 228 incident, in which nationalist troops killed rioters who were protesting against official corruption. In 1949, Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Party, or the KMT, is defeated by Mao Zedong's Communist force. Chiang Kai-shek flees to Taiwan and establishes the KMT there. By studying the time period between then and now, I was able to identify what I viewed as a transitional period in Taiwan's history. Within that period, democracy did not always seem inevitable, but instead there seemed to be a gradual progression or build-up to that point. As an overview, major milestones in this transitional period include the early implementation of elections, increased relations with the United States, a period of political reform which saw the creation of the DPP, or Democratic Progressive Party, and the first parliamentary elections. These events culminated in the election of 2000, which witnessed the victory of the DPP for the first time. The 1950s to 80s was a time of rapid industrial development, as well as a time of change in international relations. In 1968, the first elections were held to replace deceased deputies that were elected by China. This was a way for Taiwan and its government to increase the legitimacy of the party. In 1971, Taiwan loses its seat at the United Nations to Beijing, signifying a turning in diplomatic relations to China instead of Taiwan. In 1972, Chiang Kai-shek's son is appointed Taiwan premier. In 1979, the United States shifts its diplomatic recognition from Beijing to Taipei and enacts the Taiwan Relations Act, which aims to help Taiwan defend itself. This indicates a shift from China to Taiwan. In the 1980s, there are multiple steps to further include native Taiwanese into the political system. Ching Kuo picks a Taiwanese-born vice president to succeed him. In 1986, he also begins political reforms in which there is more freedom of the press and the allowance for new political parties. This allows for the Democratic Progressive Party, or the DPP, to be formed, and it is Taiwan's first opposition party. In 1987, martial law is lifted, and this signifies an increased relationship with mainland China. Ching Kuo then dies, and soon after, the National Assembly elects Lee Teng-hui as the president of Taiwan. In 1992, early parliamentary elections were held, and the next year, cross-strait talks were held in Singapore. At these talks, top leaders from both Taiwan and China met to discuss bilateral ties. Both Beijing and Taipei's nationalist government had said that they were committed to the eventual reunification of Taiwan and China, much to the disagreements of the DPP. In 1996, Lee Teng-hui becomes the first directly elected president in a landslide vote. He is sometimes called the father of Taiwan's democracy, even though he was the chairman of the Nationalist Party. Many democratic reforms occurred under his term. He was a controversial leader both in Taiwan and mainland China. Critics accused him of betraying his party, the KMT, and secretly supporting Taiwanese independence. In an attempt to discredit Li, China carried out a show of military strength in the Taiwan Strait, which prompted the U.S. to send aircraft carriers into the region as a sign that Washington would not tolerate military hostility. He was accused of corruption while in office, and after leaving office, he was expelled from the KMT for helping to found the pro-independence Taiwan Solidarity Union, which works alongside the DPP. In the year 2000, the DPP was elected for the first time. This signified the end of 50 years of nationalist rule. Chen Shui-bian was named president, fueling tensions with China. In 2003, a law was passed by Parliament to permit referenda on national sovereignty, meaning that someday in the future there could be a vote on declaring independence from mainland China. In 2004, Chen was elected to a second term, with Annette Lu as vice president. In recent years, there has been another back and forth between nationalist and democratic powers in Taiwan. In 2008, Ma is elected president, meaning that the Nationalist Party returns to power. He then increases trade, economic, and tourist ties with mainland China. In 2011, Tsai Ing-wen is chosen by the DPP as chairwoman. She is considered more centrist and less pro-independence than some of the other people in the DPP. Ma wins another term in 2012. However, his popularity falls due to suspected corruption. He is later arrested and jailed to a 19-year sentence. In 2016, Tsai Ing-wen is elected president, meaning that the DPP returns to power, and Taiwan has its first female president. By reviewing the literature, I have determined 4 factors that I believe contributed to the democratization of Taiwan. These include rapid economic growth, even distribution of wealth, and an increase in human capital, the gradual introduction of elections, and the attitudes of top leaders within Taiwan. GDP per capita is a measure of a country's economic output per person. It is useful when comparing countries because it provides a way of quantifying the standard of living. Essentially, it addresses how prosperous a country feels to each of its citizens. Here we can see that the GDP per capita in Taiwan rose by an impressive amount since the 1960s, while the growth rate in China has remained relatively stagnant. This increase in standard of living for the citizens of Taiwan has resulted in a society that was better prepared to effectively handle a transition in political power. According to Lawrence Lau, an economist at Stanford University, Taiwan has done extremely well despite many challenges, including unfavorable resource endowment and population density. Over the last century, gross national product per capita has grown from approximately $700 to almost $13,000 in 2000 prices, representing a growth rate of 6% per year. In addition to this, during the rapid economic growth of the mid-60s to early 80s, the distribution of wealth became more equal instead of less. This is important because high income inequality can cause social unrest, especially if the inequality is due to corruption or fraud and not differences in ability. The chart here, taken from a presentation at Stanford University, shows the increasing levels of human capital across multiple nations. Taiwan is shown in bright green. While it is outperformed by the non-Asian G5, Japan, and Hong Kong, its average human capital is much higher than mainland China, represented here in red. This increase in human capital is partially due to poverty alleviation policies enacted in Taiwan, which included public investment in basic education for the citizens. While the Democratic political party was not elected until the year 2000, Taiwan had been familiarizing itself with elections for many decades prior to that time. In the late 1960s, elections were held to fill low-level positions that were made vacant when the Beijing elected officials passed away. In 1990, there was a parliamentary election to elect the president, and 2 years later there was another set of parliamentary elections. Li's election in 1996 represented the first democratic presidential election, leading up to the DPP's election in 2000. This gradual build-up to fully democratic elections allowed for a smoother transition, whereas a sudden transition could have acted as a shock to the system. It is possible that if the transition had been made more immediate, there would have been more social upheaval, riots, and overall political chaos. The transition to democracy was also made possible through the actions of various leaders of Taiwan. As President Chen Kuo sought to increase the legitimacy of the government by involving more native-born Taiwanese in the political process. Prior to this, the legislative and executive branches were dominated by former mainland Chinese officials of the Nationalist Party. He opposed both Taiwanese recognition of the Chinese Communist regime and calls for unification. Li, as mentioned before, won Taiwan's first direct popular presidential election. His policies helped to support both agricultural and industrial developments for Taiwan. Annette and Liu are both outspoken members of the DPP who are not afraid to push for democracy. This quote by the previous Vice President, Annette Liu, exemplifies the feelings of many within the DPP. Taiwan matters because of its vital role in spreading democracy in East Asia. Taiwan matters because of its strategic importance to promote peace in the Pacific region. How realistic is Annette Liu's belief? My outlook is rather pessimistic. According to the findings of Larry Diamond, while there are some superficial similarities between the circumstances in Taiwan and China that seem favorable to a similar transition, the differences may be too great to overcome. Both share a common language and some overlap in culture and history. According to Gilly, both political systems have their origins in the revolutionary politics of early 20th century China. Both adapted under authoritarian rule after intense political traumas, in Taiwan's case, the retreat of the KMT to the island in 1949, and for China, the bloodshed and upheaval of Mao Zedong's years. In both cases, there was a period of intense economic growth, the effects of which are still being experienced by China today. There are, however, many important differences to note. Here it is clear that economic growth in GDP per capita in China, denoted in red, has been lagging behind that of Taiwan, shown in purple. In addition, the distribution of that wealth within China is increasingly unequal, which can lead to social unrest. In addition, there has been underinvestment in human capital, damage to the environment, and pervasive official corruption, according to Larry Diamond. Diamond also argues that we must take into consideration differences in the world historical situations that Taiwan faced as it transitioned and that China will confront in the future. In describing Taiwan, he stated that it is a relatively small and insecure society that needed to democratize to refashion its international legitimacy and maintain support of its most vital ally, the United States. China, on the other hand, he views as a rising global power that finds itself in tension and potentially someday at war with the United States. While circumstances do not seem primed for a smooth or swift transition to democracy, it may be possible in the future. As one of the world's largest and fastest growing economies, China's influence will continue to be felt around the world. In order to understand the increasingly globalized world, we must therefore have an understanding of the major players. Perhaps most importantly, Taiwan itself may play a role in the possibility of democracy in China. Taiwan may be a tiny island nation compared to the expansive mainland China. However, Taiwanese citizens have repeatedly shown their willingness to be engaged in the political future of Taiwan. On the right is one of the many photos showing the public backlash to mainland China's calls to abandon the push for independence. The decisions of Taiwan may have lasting impacts on the prospects of democratization in China. Some academics believe that if Taiwan continues to push for independence, there may be a nationalist backlash in mainland China, making democracy less attractive for Chinese citizens who may view Taiwan as an issue instead of as an aspiration. What I have outlined here does not imply that China will not someday transition to democracy, but instead that its potential transition would likely be more drawn out, motivated by different factors, and face more political and social turmoil than that of Taiwan. Even if democracy is not in the near future for mainland China, Taiwan provides proof that the spread of democracy in Asia is possible. Amid regional uncertainty, I urge American audiences to remain aware of Taiwan's influence, both regionally and globally, and to watch to see how its future unfolds.